Hello, everyone. Welcome to Supporting Rural Students Breakout Group. We are excited to talk all things rural with you. My name is Andrew Moe. I'm Director of Admissions at Swarthmore College, and I'm also co-leader of the NACAC Rural and Small Town Special Interest Group.
Hi, everyone. My name is Marjorie Bentley. I am a Senior Associate Director of Admissions at the University of Chicago. I am also the Trott Director of our Emerging Rural Leaders Program. And it goes to Farish.
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Farish Jerman. I'm an Associate Dean of Admission at Emory University, and part of my office responsibilities are to oversee our outreach and communication engagement with rural students and their counselors. So excited to be here today talking about this important topic.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dustin Lin. I'm the Director of College Counseling at Battleground Academy. We're an independent K-12 school in Franklin, Tennessee, a suburb of Nashville. In addition to that, I'm also one of the co-leaders of the NACAC Small and Rural Town SIG, along with Andrew. And beyond that, I'm also a former rural student myself, so deeply am connected with that part of my background as well. So we're excited to have you all here.
Right, wonderful. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started with doing sort of an overview. We don't exactly know who is in our audience today. You may be in the most remote part of our country and you know a lot more about rural than I do, or you could be very new to this conversation. So we wanted to start out by sort of laying out the landscape of rural identity, small town students, and then get started with sort of an institutional overview. We will also highlight resources that might be available to you if you are a rural serving community-based organization or your admissions officer by going through the SIG resources. And we are going to open it up for a discussion today. So super excited to be with all of you. Thanks so much for attending this breakout session. So rural students or rural folks in the United States are plentiful, about 59 million people, or 20% of our population in the United States. That doesn't include 29 million people in small towns. And so it depends on what your definition is, but we're talking 25, 30% or so of the country. That is just in the United States alone. It's important to recognize that rural students are actually all around the world, and they have differential and differentiated access to SAT and ACT sites and all of the other things, counseling resources. We don't have enough time to dig into rural Zimbabwe today, but I just wanted to recognize that because that absolutely is part of this conversation. The rural population is more educated than in recent decades, but challenges still persist. We have the highest graduation rate among high schools. So high school students in rural spaces have a higher graduation rate than their urban and suburban peers. However, they have the lowest participation rate in post-secondary education. When they are going to college, we are taking a very broad stroke with regard to 2-year and 4-year and technical education and vocational education. They are overrepresented in community colleges and regional publics. So there's nothing wrong with that. It's just part of the data that we wanted to highlight. And they are certainly underrepresented at institutions like we represent, the highly selective colleges. We also want to recognize that we are simply 3 colleges and a former admissions officer, now turned college counselor. We don't have any public representation on the panel, right? We don't have racial or ethnic diversity on our panel. We just want to recognize that rural spaces are incredibly diverse. And so Western Alaska is very different than Eastern Maine. The Upper Peninsula of Michigan is very different than the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas. So it's important to recognize that these spaces, while we are talking about rural in general or rural and small town students in general, they're very, very diverse. About 25% of rural students are students of color. And so if you have this preconceived notion of simply white students or white farming students, that's not the case. That can be the case depending on where you're serving and who you are and what community you're coming from, but it's not always the case, right? the SIG has identified, the special interest group, sorry, or the SIG is what we call it, has identified about 12,000 high schools in the United States that are rural and small town serving. That includes both public as well as private schools. And it's going to include places like small Christian schools in South Georgia, as well as boarding schools that actually have a catchment zone that is more urban in nature, right? So we take a really broad look at that. We also want to recognize that oftentimes, and this is especially true when we're talking about under-resourced students, we take this deficit approach, and we want to avoid that, right? So it's easy to fall into what are the challenges of rural students. And so you could, say maybe low college aspirations, which actually isn't entirely true, but it's a common myth, or students who want to stay really close to home, or the issues around physical access. We're going to talk about those challenges. Those challenges are real, and it's our jobs as adults to overcome those challenges and help students overcome those challenges. But we really want to take an asset approach, right? Things like high school graduation rates that I mentioned, grit, resilience, determination, right? Those are aspects that students are bringing to our campuses. Family interdependence, and really a connection to home and community, and skills learned in family businesses and co-curricular experiences, and the really diverse array of things that students are getting involved with. So that's a very quick overview. Sometimes we do an entire hour presentation just on that overview, so we have to be quick because we want to get to discussion. But Dustin and I wanted to talk a little bit about the Rural and Small Town Special Interest Group. This is by the National Association for College Admission Counseling. What's great is that it's free to you if you are engaged in these issues. If you are a former rural person yourself and now you live in a city, but you are really connected to these identities, you can join. It's free to join, and you don't have to be a NACAC member. It's almost 1,700 members across the United States now in all 50 states. And we offer resources to admission officers like a downloadable spreadsheet of 12,000 rural schools, so you can start tagging that and identifying that in your pipeline. Or resources for high school counselors. We have a list of fly-in programs. Obviously, no one's flying anywhere right now, but in normal times, we have a list of fly-in programs that colleges offer to school counselors and CBO advisors, right? Dustin, did you want to talk a little bit about any of the resources that you would identify beyond those?
Absolutely. Yeah. So one of the great things about the SIG too is we all kind of have our specialty area that we oversee. And one of the things about which I'm really passionate for the SIG is professional development, right? Because we understand that professionals on both sides of the desk, in addition to CBOs and folks who are honestly in their community simply helping rural and small town students attain college and think critically about their futures and how college fits into that picture, is through professional development. And in particular, we offer a few different series. That's usually we have a program or two a month. Two of which that I help oversee are SIG discussions, where we have a topic of focus, and then sometimes we'll have a guest speaker who will give a little bit of information from their expert perspective on some best practices, or maybe a little bit of an information or a research overview about that topic. And then we'll have small group discussions through breakout rooms on Zoom as well. Because what's so great about it is, of our 1,700 members, folks are from coast to coast. So with the ease of technology now, we are able to engage folks regardless of your environment in order to think critically and to share practices there. The other one that I've been most active with is our Sig Learning Labs, where we have had or I'm actually planning one right now with a few different colleges to talk about the highly selective admission process and to do many case studies as well. So I think beyond the tremendous resources available through the membership listing, the guides that we also have interactive opportunities for professionals to share experiences, share practices, and just share the realities of working with those students and counselors, but then also being able to share challenges and opportunities about how to grow your own program or outreach, or how to do this collective work better ttoo.
Thanks, Dustin. So now we're going to just do a very short overview of our institution commitment to rural students. So I'll start with Swarthmore. So Swarthmore College is a small liberal arts college just outside of the city of Philadelphia. When I started there almost 5 years ago, we really identified underserved and under-resourced students and how we could break down barriers for those students. So of course that includes first generation, low income students, students of color, community college transfers, transfers, but one of those populations was rural and small town students, really recognizing that they are contributing to the vast diversity on our campus and the really important conversations that are happening inside of the classroom. So we've developed a program called Small Towns at Swarthmore, and it's a visibility campaign. It's to ensure that students and their counselors and their families can see themselves in our process on our campus. We have a website dedicated to resources for students so that they can see themselves again in the admissions process. And if that's a salient identity, they can identify that. It also includes emails to students as well as counselors and webinars that are focused on highlighting the rural college experience, what it's like to be a rural student at Swarthmore. We also are affirmative in our admissions decisions as well as our fly-in decisions for rural and small town students. And we have really done a lot of work on the back end to ensure that when an admissions officer opens up an application, they can see that that student is rural or brings that rural perspective, so that we can identify really incredible students in our process. And then finally, we have a student group that is blossoming, which is really exciting for us. It's a sort of a mentorship group where upperclassmen are helping younger classmen, right? So students who have never been on a train before, that is certainly part of that rural experience sometimes, where you've never been on a train or you can't necessarily, you don't have to navigate like, how do I get a ticket? These sorts of things. This was something that our rural students brought up to us because we have a train station on our campus. And they said, wouldn't it be great if we brought them under our wing and we talked about that? So it's smaller things like that, but it's also larger things inside of the classroom or the support that we provide students, the policies that we have that may disproportionately affect rural students without us knowing. So we really want to take this very thoughtful approach at Swarthmore. So that's a little bit about my institution.
I'll give a quick overview of what we're doing at the University of Chicago for our rural initiatives. Three big pieces of our initiative, and the first would be our early engagement programs. These are designed to interact with high school students in their freshman year of high school and as they're going into their senior year of high school. Planting that seed a little bit earlier in the process and letting them see all of the options that are available to them. They should not be limited by their geography. And the idea is early exposure and early engagement. So those are two of our programs. The other one for older students is actually for kind of exposes them to the college classroom. So they take a class over the summer at the University of Chicago. They live in the dorms, they eat in the dining halls. It's really a test drive for what college is gonna be like. It's extremely hard to ask a student what they want out of college when they haven't experienced it. So it's a really great way to kind of open that door and bring students to campus and let them try out, living in a big city. Some students may like it and some students may decide, they want something different. It's really about helping them find that path and figure out what they want out of college. The second piece of our rural initiatives are once the students are on campus and how we're supporting them. It is a big transition. It's the third largest city in the United States in Chicago. And we really want them to feel like they have supports in a couple of different places at the university. One of the biggest supporters of this program so far have been our faculty, and they sign on as mentors for students, especially ones that we have tagged in our system as coming from rural and small town high schools. And the others are their own peers. So we have a Rural Student Alliance on campus where they can connect with each other and share challenges and things that they're really excited about. The third piece would be advising. So we have specialized academic advising and career advising for those students. We have really pushed the last 2 years creating internships and opportunities in rural areas. And these are open to anyone. These are open for our rural students and then any student who really just wants to be exposed to living in a smaller town or a rural area. So we have opportunities for students to go back into their hometowns if they're from rural areas, or go work for a company that really affects rural America. And so we think that's a really important way to bring students back into their communities and into other rural communities. Because the idea, and you're gonna see this from all three of our institutions here, is we're not looking to poach the best and the brightest rural students. We want to give them options and opportunities. And I also really want to see them go back and share those opportunities and options with their hometowns and their communities. So that's a second big part. The third part is actually through our Institute of Politics, and it's a program called Bridging the Divide. And the idea is to create a dialogue. There are a lot of students, especially urban or non-rural students, who just haven't considered the rural perspective in a lot of ways. And this is an opportunity to bring these students together into a room, create dialogue and conversation about a wide variety of topics, and just start the wheels turning in a way that we can learn to talk and understand and listen to each other and create a more kind of empathetic future. So those are the three programs that we have at UChicago, and I'm going to turn over to Farish.
Thanks, Margie. So while I myself do not have a rural identity, members of my family do, from current generations and previous generations, and we've reflected a good bit on the impact that can have in the college admission process. And I've been really excited to be working with Emory University and with our entire team about more intentionally engaging with rural communities over the past couple of years. And when we were reflecting on this session ahead of time, I felt like I wanted to bring up this narrative and kind of go back in time a little bit to a couple of years ago when we were starting this process, and really acknowledge that there may be a number of you who are admission counselors, members of senior leadership at colleges and universities who are recognizing that there are not many rural students in your community, and you want to improve and increase that access. But maybe you're not quite at the point of having funding and logistics for full-fledged rural specific programs, which I think is where we all aspire to be for all of our cohorts that could use a little bit more access, but you may not be at that point yet. But that doesn't mean that each and every one of your team members in the admission office can't do very intentional acts in the recruitment as well as reading process that improve accessibility. So that's really what I wanted my narrative with you to focus on today. So when I look back in time over the things that were really pivotal in our work at Emory, it was really looking at a lot of the wonderful research and data that was brought forth by the SIG that Andrew and Dustin have discussed, and putting together a manual for our admission team about how to better incorporate rural communities in our recruitment, which includes a couple of different approaches. It's really pushing admission counselors to think about the space that they're traversing when they cover an entire state and are going from major city to major city. And instead of thinking of that as just a snapshot in time to get from A to Z, reflecting on the communities that they're driving through or traveling through that they could be stewards of higher education within. And in that vein, recognizing that there is so much data to show that rural communities are not getting the same level of visits from colleges, the same amount of visits from colleges and universities, I should say. So being intentional when we're in those spaces of asking, how can we best serve? And maybe it's not just solely talking about our institution, but it's trying to be a steward of higher education by offering an essay writing workshop or a presentation about holistic review or selective college admission, or anything that you feel would be of benefit to a large group of students, and having that dialogue with a counselor and really listening to what the counseling community is telling us about their needs. So that was a really pivotal part of our recruitment process. And just to Andrew's point, recognizing that when we talk about rurality across this country, it does look so different, and those needs may look very different. And having our admission counselors really internalize and reflect on that. And then when it came to the reading process, and I think all of our institutions here today use some form of holistic review, so context is key, but applying that to the rural setting, I think was really pushing people to do things like have a Google map open at all times and put in not only the student's address, but their high school address, and really get a look of what their surroundings were like, and have that context in mind when we were looking at their non-academic engagement, and also recognizing what data and research have shown about how non-academic engagement can appear different for rural students than it might for urban and suburban students. And if your team is unused to reading rural students, maybe that's been a really small cohort of your applicant pool thus far, knowing that there need to be sensitivities and nuance of consideration when reviewing those portions of a student's application. And then certainly really sussing out that voice and the narrative that a student can bring and what they can offer to a college community, and considering all that they've accomplished within that context and all that they would bring to a college campus. And something we did this past year that I think was really wonderful was, after we did the first read, we have a number of concurrent committees that allow us as a team to go back through and look beyond a regional scope and re-review all of our applications, and we had a rural concurrent committee for the first time. So we were able to kind of group all of the applicants from across the world, but especially domestically, since we are a little bit nuanced in our approach here in this session. We'll focus on domestic, but allowed us to group together all of our students domestically that had either a College Board-based tag or the secondary school report tag that identified their school location as one of the three different categories of rural. We did this for small town as well, but we'll focus on the rural here. And so we grouped together all the students that fell in those 3 categories of rural and just re-reviewed and made sure that when we, as a committee-based evaluation process, as a team initially, had really taken into account their rural context and the challenges that posed, but also the wonderful contributions that would mean for our community. And I think that was a wonderful chance for us to reflect as a team on what this cohort of our community really means in our applicant process and what it can bring to our community as a whole. So we're again trying to stay brief so the majority of this can be discussion based. So those are just my quick highlights of things you might consider doing, and absolutely we can chat more in the discussion process if needed, but I want to go ahead and turn this over to Dustin. Oh, Dustin, I think you're muted.
All right, if you're playing along bingo, that's the first time in our session at least that you get to move off. I think you're muted. So thanks, Farish. So it's I'm from the high school perspective, right? And I don't serve rural students unless your definition of rural includes some rural fringe communities that our students will drive in from. So it might be interesting to think, what's this guy doing on this panel? So I mentioned a little bit about my own rural identity earlier, and I think that at least when we work with our students, when we're talking about many identities, whether it's ethnicity, first gen status, being a member of the LGBTQI plus community, I think that having a certain level of vulnerability yourself in talking about one's own story often helps students and others who share those experiences feel comfortable in relating that identity as well. Because many folks feel very different about their rural identity. Some folks, for some folks, it's a badge of honor. For some folks, there might be a little bit of an imposter syndrome or a complex associated with that. So I think that one thing and one thing that I hope to bring to our SIG in these discussions is this idea of a professional who has gone to college from a rural environment, just as kind of the humanistic side. In addition to that, though, I'm going to steal a phrase from Farish, though, and that's intentional acts. I think that folks, when you are able to recognize your privilege and opportunities given your institutions, when you can merge that with other access initiatives, some real magic can happen. So, for instance, here at Battleground Academy, we're really fortunate. We are in Williamson County, which is a suburb of Nashville. As I mentioned earlier, it's a relatively wealthy county in the country. And beyond that, we have a rather homogenous student community. We're really growing that. So I'm excited to see that we have more students of color joining us, students from different socioeconomic backgrounds. But at the end of the day, we're a Southern majority institution for a secondary school when you think about it. What we've done then is in the College Center here is we've tried to use our resources to uplift and partner with folks from very different experiences and different resource bases themselves. And a couple examples of that. So we'll go from very easy to a full out program. So one, when an admission counselor traditionally books a visit with us at Battleground Academy, in that confirmation email and in our summer solicitation to admission officers to say, hey, do you want to visit our campus? We've also kind of done some of the heavy lifting for them and have put together a resource that lists about 100 schools within a drivable area, or at least a reachable area, where students identify or the school itself identifies as serving a minority majority population, where the free and reduced lunch percentage is of a certain percent, or that is designated as rural by the federal definitions as well. So we know that we're going to be in contact with admission counselors. We want to use that opportunity to also suggest that they reach out to our colleagues at schools that might not already have that social capital or those connections built in. Another example is even in our own case studies program. A lot of you are familiar with case studies programs. And you're probably aware that many of them that are hosted by private schools, if you look around the room, they're all private schools oftentimes. Now, case studies exist in many different functions. But for us, we recognize that there was a great opportunity to bring a case studies program to students and our counseling colleagues from around the local area. So instead of partnering with other independent schools or private schools, we partnered, again, with schools that typically work with underserved students in the local area who also do tremendous things with their kiddos, but who don't have the resources or time to plan that program. And it was so rewarding to see BGA students mingling with students at an event that might not be the traditional type of educational event that they would have attended previously. We also opened that up to counselors from any school in the Middle Tennessee area so that they could attend too. And then finally, an event we put on a few years ago was called Connect Tennessee, where we had a couple of folks. Andrew actually flew down from Swarthmore, and we had a couple of other colleges attend. But the main thrust of the program was to talk about college admission, share best practices, and also to learn about different ways to empower students. And while we put that program on, the budget was next to nothing, and it didn't have to be anything. We just needed a space and places for these folks to congregate and talk about admissions. And we opened that up to any counselor in the state of Tennessee who's willing to drive in. And we had about 30 folks who came. So I think the big takeaway from my position is if you're sitting there, if you're working in an independent school or a suburban or even an urban school, and you really care about rural work, begin thinking about how you can integrate either in that small dimension of just getting some names out there to folks, or if you want brownie points and want to put together a little program like Connect TN, you can put that together and also incorporate your peers and colleagues in rural and small town serving communities and their students.
Margie, if I may jump back in just really quick for 2 points that Dustin inspired in my mind that I wish I had mentioned earlier, but in terms of intentional acts, if you don't have fully fledged rural specific programming, please be sure to still include rural community members, both counselors and students, in your existing programming. But be mindful when you're sending them invitations or you're confirming them to attend this program that is fully funded, that paying for that plane ticket may not be fully funding their transportation to your program. So that's one thing that I think can sometimes get lost in the shuffle of logistics, and you're thinking about a lot of different folks with a lot of different needs, and just especially if you're including rural community members for the first time, I would recommend reaching out to them individually, whether this is a counselor or a student, and just saying, I'm so excited you're attending this program. I recognize as someone in a rural community space, you may be a good ways away from an airport and the ticket is fully funded as part of this program, but what else can I do to accommodate your travel and make sure that, you know, we cover what you need to make it to our institution? And I think those extra elements go a really long way in making sure that everyone feels equitably served and included in these types of things. So keep that in the back of your mind too. Thank you, Margie.
Absolutely. So I think what we're trying to do right here is just very briefly give you all an idea of some best practices that we have worked with at our institutions. So whether it's a visibility campaign on campus and creating those social supports for students, intentional acts and being nuanced in the reading process and in your admissions office, partnering with local or other institutions in your area like Dustin has, and being very aware of your privilege and the resources that you have and sharing those resources. So we do want to open up. I know we have 2 people lined up for questions already. Please ask questions. If you are a current admissions representative and you really want your office to focus on this a little bit more and you're curious how to do that, we're happy to answer those questions. If you are a CBO partner or an access partner and you just want to talk a little bit more about the opportunities for your students or how you can help your students in this realm or with this population, please let us know that. I have TJ Walker, who you've been waiting for a while, TJ. I'm going to let you on just to see, hopefully you're still here. And I also have Peggy lined up here afterwards. So we'll see if this works. There you go. Hi, Peggy. Hello, welcome to the screen. Did you have any questions or anything that you wanted to kind of us to address as a group here for the larger panel?
Oh, No, I think you guys are doing great. I think it's a good diverse group. I'm just interested in listening.
Perfect. Great. If anyone else has questions, this is a great time to either drop them in the chat room, or if you want, you can ask it in person. Here we have Lorenzo. I'm going to bring you on, Lorenzo, okay? Hopefully. Sometimes it takes a few minutes for it to load.
Recognize that Peggy is another co-leader of our NACAC Rural and Small Town SIG, and she is incredible.
Absolutely.
Thank you. That panel, that CBO panel, man, working we had about 5 sessions just talking with that group of people. Wow, mind blown. It was so wonderful. Anyway.
That's awesome. Great. Lorenzo, so did you have any questions that you wanted us to address?
I do. Thank you guys for presenting. My question for everybody is, it's great to get the students to the campus. What are you seeing as far as student organic growth, as far as like student clubs for small and rural students?
Yeah, I think that's a great one for Andrew to start off on, because I know you have a great student-run group on campus.
Yeah, it was organic. It's awesome. They met with me and said, and I actually know the students really well because we're a pretty small school. And our 2 students worked with the Heirs Foundation in rural Tennessee. And we're different classes, but connected. Obviously, they knew each other beforehand, being connected with the same CEO, and said, how do we start this? How do we get started? And I said, oh, there's a great organization at Yale and another one at Columbia, and like trying to connect them to other student groups to say, like, how did you structure it, right? And really being sort of that resource in the admissions office. Obviously, I don't work in the Dean of Students office, but I know a lot of friends over there, and I can connect them to those types of resources, whether it's student funding or programming or those sorts of things. So ours was just purely organic versus kind of the administration, like top down saying there needs to be a student group. So it was really nice to see. And COVID sort of threw a wrench in a lot of that, though, because that was pretty much right before COVID. So hopefully they're still connecting virtually.
Yeah, I'll say for our student group, the way it started was actually a focus group that I put together. I put out a call and I said, if anyone wants to come and just talk about your experience or your transition to UChicago as a student from a rural or small town high school, let's get together. I bought pizza and I actually had like 30 kids show up, which given our rural population is quite a lot of them. And that was really exciting. After that focus group, they all stayed in touch and they said, why don't we have an RSO or a registered student organization? And I said, there's no reason not to. So I worked we have also a university-wide rural working group. So we have representatives from college advising, from counseling, from the Center for Identity and Inclusion, admissions, career advancement. So we all get together. And I told my colleague at the Center for Leadership and inclusion, I was like, these students want to form an organization. He's like, send them my way. And then they had their own little organization. That was also in February. And things have been interesting since then. But I think they have stayed connected. They have a Facebook group now, and they all talk to each other on there. So it's been a good resource for them. But I did kind of nudge them in that direction with the focus group and some pizza.
Well, admittedly, my narrative for Emory is a bit similar in the COVID complications of saying there are things we wanted to get off the ground, that there's a bit of a wrench in those plans. But one thing I want to add to what's already been said is there's just been a lot of thoughtfulness too about engaging with students for an affinity group that's based on an identity that they may have completely different definitions for, or may also have very different feelings about. I actually just finished a master's program and my thesis was on recruiting and enrolling rural high school students to four-year colleges and universities. And some of the phenomenological study that I did focused on kind of how students in those communities think about that identity, how they internalize that, and then how they comfortably engage with that when they're on a college campus, especially if that college campus is in a really different setting. So Emory, well, quite frankly, all three colleges that are represented here are really great examples of a setting that's very different from where a rural student might come from. So I think a lot of our thought process about creating, if we can call it a rural student affinity group, a rural small town student affinity group, has also been wanting to make sure that we're embracing the most inclusive communication and definition of that possible, and that students feel that label, shall we say, in a positive way, rather than having any trepidation about showing up to an event or owning that label in a way when they're standing on a very metropolitan campus and wondering, you know, what assumptions their peers may or may not make about them and their identities and their beliefs as a result of being a rural student. So I just think there's a lot to consider here for any college or university that's putting together a group like this. And when it happens organically in a way that's been described, and some anecdotes here, of course, that solves itself a little bit, but just when you are doing it top down, you are thinking of this as an institution of creating that. These are some important points of consideration, in my opinion.
Yeah, and the only thing to add to my comment is really just the intentionality around that again. So I'm thinking about my own experience at the institution where I attended, and having a rural identity is an invisible identity, right? And often that's not represented on campus. There's not a center typically that you can go to. And again, we know that other identities also have issues seeking out support and resources on campuses as well. But in its own right, the things that Margie's saying, like, hey, getting together maybe your admitted students for the year and starting there and saying, hey, let's have pizza. I would love to learn more about your experience. Just acknowledging that those students and their unique perspectives do exist on your campus and giving them opportunities to congregate, share, to connect with other resources as well. Because oftentimes rural students don't associate so many of the issues that they experience with being rural, right? So whether they might have an intersecting identity and might be first generation, or might have come from a high school. And again, high schools manifest themselves in so many different ways in rural environments, but many of them don't have access to AP courses, for example. That student might be thinking, wow, I'm just behind the curve. I'm not cut out for here. Or that imposter syndrome that we were talking about, that they're not making the connection that some of this might actually have to do with their environment prior to matriculating to your campus. So helping them see that their identity as rural can also be connected to other resources and opportunities on campus, I think is important too.
Can I throw something out there? We had a thing a couple weeks ago. Palouse Pathways had Corrine from Yale and Clayton, who's the head of their rural student group, do a presentation for us. And I asked him at the end, why don't you talk, all these kids aren't going to go to Yale. Why don't you talk to these kids about how they could start a rural student group at their school? And it was so cool. It was such an empowering thing for them to hear. You can go on this campus and, you know, you can assert yourself and talk to people about how to get what you need, and if that means starting a group. So I really, that was quite a moment. And I was thinking maybe even the SIG, maybe we should get all our rural student groups together to do a presentation for students, right? So they can think about whether there's anything like that at their school, or whether they want to put themselves out there to start something.
It's a great idea. Yeah. Peggy, so I think as long as we have you here, it would be really great to talk about a little bit how institutions and CBOs are working together specifically to support rural students, since that is how we become better together. And I think you have been absolutely instrumental in supporting the SIG and having that perspective. And then also you've been instrumental in kind of working with me with our Emerging Rural Leaders program and finding students and supporting those students throughout the application process and once they get here. So tell us a little bit more about your CBO and what you do and the role of CBOs in this partnership.
So my CBO is very small. It's all volunteer. It's mostly me, although, you know, there are other people doing things too. We serve hundreds of students with general information, and right now we have a group that we've started that's a cohort of kids that we're following through. I don't know. I mean, it's you know, we do different things for different kids. Our kids are not all going to selective colleges at all. In fact, the thing that my community would most like me to do is an alternatives to college fair, I mean, that gets people excited more than anything. But anyway, so we're serving a large group of about 14 different school districts in 2 different states, Idaho and Washington, with all kinds of things connected to post-secondary stuff. I think an interesting thing about my CBO for colleges to know is it's one of the few identified as rural, so I get a ton of love, which I really appreciate. But it makes me wonder how to make other things like this happen in other parts of the country. Without it, you don't need a lot of money to make it happen. So anyway, that's something I think is an interesting thought. How do you cultivate people in rural communities to be point people and things like that? I know most of the folks we deal with are high schools, and they do a great job of that. But there's some places where there's not a lot of high school engagement in this. And so how do you organically lift people up to provide support? Because I know most colleges, if they had somebody like that to go to, they would go because they come to me, So
Yeah.
how do you create places, centers of gravity in rural areas? So that's the challenge.
Absolutely. Andrew, it looks like there is a question for you in the chat.
Yeah. So thank you, Holly. There was a question about Swarthmore's USB initiative. So I wanted to just briefly explain this. We recognize the disparities and the data associated with broadband internet, right? And so if you look at urban spaces, the percentage of folks who don't have high-speed broadband internet is around 4%. If you look at rural spaces, it's more like 30%. And it actually is even more concerning in rural communities of color, and especially Native and Indigenous communities. So it's really important to recognize those types of things, because in this COVID era, we're doing everything virtually, and there really aren't too many alternatives to that. We even have to just recognize like who can't be on this panel or who can't be in this virtual room right now because they don't have access to broadband or reliable access to broadband. And that's certainly the case. So we recognize that. We want to ensure that students and their counselors can still access some of the same information that they would be getting either on campus or in like a virtual session. So we came up with the initiative where we are putting our presentation on USB drives, and we are sending those out to either schools that request them or individual students that request them. It depends on your idea of success. So I will say that I think it's successful, but it hasn't sort of like, there aren't 100 requests out there for this type of information. So what we basically did is we emailed all rural schools in the United States and said, hey, we would love to engage with you. We are setting up this webinar. If you can access it, awesome. If you can't access the webinar, though, because you might not have reliable broadband access, you can request a USB drive. And you have 2 options with that. And I don't want to be overly complicated, but we want to recognize that some schools might want the same type of experience, meaning they want to watch a presentation and then they want a Q&A, or they just want to watch a presentation, and that's fine too. So we made available a 15-minute window by phone where they could actually call in and ask us questions. So the idea is that 45 minutes you'd spend in your college center, guidance office or something, or classroom watching the Swarthmore presentation, and then Andrew would call in by phone and you would actually be able to ask questions based on that. Didn't have any takers on that one. But it's not because I don't think there's a need there. I think more it has to do with we're a tiny little college, and I'm not sure a lot of folks know who Swarthmore is. And so when you're getting this email from Swarthmore, I'm not sure it's really resonating with people. So I do think that the need is there. And I say that because for our yield activities, we also had to very quickly go to all virtual this past year. So we made that available to our admitted students, and we did have a few admitted students take us up on that. And so we put all of our panels, we recorded all of them, put them all on USB drives and sent those out. So I do think it is successful. It's just not going to be sort of like everyone's going to be requesting this. We also recognize that some students, especially in COVID times, don't always have a USB-enabled device. They might be using a Chromebook, or they might just be using their phone. So we're starting a WhatsApp business account. And that we also had students take us up on sending videos, smaller videos, through WhatsApp. And so if you are going to the local McDonald's and you can tap into the Wi-Fi, or you have a data plan, you can often use WhatsApp for videos. And there's a business plan that can be used by colleges and universities. So we haven't launched that yet, but we're doing investigation right now just to try to meet everyone where they are. And that's going to be just living on our website. If you have that request, if you identify that need, you can always request a USB drive, or you can tap into our WhatsApp account.
Of intentionality and trying to make this available for as many students as possible. I also want to kind of reiterate what Peggy said. Schools, we are looking for community-based organizations to partner with. Like, this partnership is so important to us, and it does enable us to reach as many students as possible, especially for students who may not have the resources at their high school. Community-based organizations do an amazing job of helping those students and filling those gaps and connecting them and are their higher education partners. So I want to reiterate that again. I've
actually got a question for you, Margie.
Yeah.
So you mentioned partnership. And I think that, and this really, I really want to start with you, but then also hear maybe from Andrew and Farish as well. When you mentioned partnerships, if folks are sitting in the room and they're either a college or a CBO person, and they might be thinking, all right, great, let's partner. What does that mean? Is it just reaching out to see, hey, can we do a virtual visit at the school? Is there programming? I know that you have this wonderful, I'm going to mess it up. Is it Emerging Rural Leaders, right? The program that you have. Is it just sharing information? When you say partner, what are meaningful partnerships that come to your mind, and Andrew and Farish as well, that we can create in this space to uplift counselors, CBO leaders, and our students?
That is a great question. In terms of our partnership opportunities, there are quite a few options. We are more than happy to do sessions. I think Farish mentioned this as well, that they do essay writing workshops. We do a fit finding workshop. We do a holistic review workshop. So a wide variety of case studies. Like, we're more than willing to run a case studies for a community-based organization, right? You don't have to put that program together yourself. We have files already curated and created, and we can do this and run it for you. So basically, it's kind of leaning on the higher education partners to share the information that we have, right? And whatever that is, it doesn't have to be for any of us institution specific. And I think that's something that a lot of people think is, I am only going to talk about UChicago. I may use UChicago as an example a few times, but I'm not just going to talk about UChicago. I'm going to make this applicable to a wide variety of students. We completely understand, especially at the highly selective level, not every student is going to want to go to the University of Chicago. Not every student's going to apply. Not every student is going to thrive, let's say, in that route. And that is okay. That is fine. I would love to share information with as many students as possible that will help them along their path, whatever that path ends up being. So I think that's really the way that I think of it. We also do have a CBO advisory board at the University of Chicago, and Peggy is on it, where we're just kind of asking, we're putting our hand out and saying, what do you need from us? What information is going to be most helpful from us? And how can we be better partners in this process? Because I may be offering you workshops all day, but if you don't think that's what your students need, that doesn't mean anything. So I'll turn it over to Farish and Andrew, and it looks like we just have a few more minutes.
In the interest of time, I will just echo the sentiments that Margie conveyed. I just think being as open as possible to requests, and please reach out to us. You can reach out to me if you want a starting point. I'll get you to the right person if I'm not necessarily the end point, but we're also trying to be more proactive about reaching out. But partnerships can come in so many different forms, and we're all ears and open minds. Andrew?
Yeah, totally. It's the same. So we just want to thank everyone for listening and for being part of our breakout group. I know that the closing remarks are going to be starting very soon. If you want to stay engaged with us, Dustin did post a link. I know we have 10 new members as a result of doing this breakout group, so good job, great. But Dustin posted a link if you wanted to join the SIG, you want to be part of a longer term conversation, you are most welcome to be part of that group, and we would welcome you with open arms. So thank you so much for attending, and thanks to my great panelists as well for adding their contributions.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening.